When you've gotta go, you've gotta go. And I'm gonna tell you where you can find public restrooms when you're visiting Washington, D.C. Before we get to the details, hello. My name is Rob. I'm a tour guide and the founder of Trip Hacks DC Tours. On this channel, I share my best tips, tricks, and hacks for visitors who want to explore Washington, D.C. And I also host the Trip Hacks DC podcast, where this question about restroom availability came up in episode 48 about accessible travel tips. So I highly recommend giving that episode a listen if this is a topic of importance to you. Now, the good news is, as a traveler, you will generally find that Washington, D.C. has pretty good public restroom availability, at least at the main tourist sites, including around the monuments and the museums. But it's far from perfect, and things can get a bit trickier, especially in some of the neighborhoods. So we'll talk about those too. And I am super curious about whether you have visited DC and have a favorite public restroom here. If you do, go ahead and leave it down in the comments so we can all learn from each other. Now, let's start here around the National Mall. Around the tidal basin, you will find public restrooms at the Jefferson Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, and 2 restrooms at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. On the National Mall side, you'll also find public restrooms at the Lincoln Memorial, the Vietnam Memorial, and 2 near the World War II Memorial, as well as one at the Washington Monument Lodge and another one just to the north of the lodge. So when you're out exploring the monuments, there will pretty much always be a public restroom nearby. I can't promise it will be a particularly nice public restroom, but it's something. Now, over here on the museum side of the National Mall, every single Smithsonian Museum and the National Gallery of Art will have public restrooms. The frustrating thing is that the museums in this part of the park will require going inside and through security, even if it's just to use the restroom. And while I think museum security has become better and more efficient and lines are not nearly as long as they used to be, it's still an annoyance. One hack is that the National Gallery of Art Sculpture Garden has a restroom and you don't need to go through security to use it. Similarly, directly across the street from the Air and Space Museum is the Dwight Eisenhower Memorial. It is a bit of an underappreciated memorial, but the good news, practically speaking, is that it has a restroom and it's outdoors and does not require a trip through security. And while technically not a museum, the U.S. Botanic Gardens is nearby, has restrooms, and does not have a security checkpoint, at least not in 2023. The most important caveat is that the Botanic Garden, Sculpture Garden, and all of these museums have operating hours, and if you're out past, say, 6 o'clock, they're not going to be available. The Capitol Visitor Center also has plenty of public restrooms available, and you can go inside the Visitor Center even if you don't have a tour scheduled. But the security line can get long and you cannot bring anything inside that's on the Capitol Visitor Center prohibited list. So depending on how badly you have to go and what you're carrying with you, this one might not be the best option. Near the White House Visitor Center is your best bet for a public restroom in that area. The Visitor Center is at 15th and Pennsylvania Avenue in the U.S. Commerce Department headquarters. And you do not need a White House tour reservation or anything like that to go inside. Elsewhere downtown, if you're looking for a restroom, the building that houses the Smithsonian, American Art Museum, and National Portrait Gallery is a pretty good bet. Just be mindful that these museums close at 7 o'clock, which is later than other Smithsonian museums, but still not particularly late. Another spot downtown is the MLK Library, which is the main downtown branch of the DC Public Library. It recently underwent a big renovation, is beautiful now, and I would say has above average public restrooms. If you're in the vicinity of Union Station, of course, there are restrooms in the station. Train station restrooms, just like airport restrooms, are usually not particularly nice, but they are there when you need them. So those are some options north of the National Mall, but what about if you're south of the mall? There are public restrooms available at the L'Enfant Plaza Food Court, and several restrooms available at the Wharf. And these Wharf restrooms are not inside businesses, and anyone can use them. And I actually think that's quite nice. Now, let's talk about finding public restrooms in some of the other neighborhoods, because this is where I think things can start to get a bit tricky. If you've watched TripHacks DC videos before, then you know that two neighborhoods I think are good for visitors are Georgetown and Capitol Hill. And I have in-depth videos on both of those neighborhoods, plus a few others, so check out the video description for a link to the playlist where they're all located. Georgetown and Capitol Hill are both old, historic neighborhoods with classic DC row houses and old neighborhood vibes. I already mentioned the main downtown public library, but in general, public libraries are another good bet for public restrooms. And there is one public library in Georgetown and two of them in Capitol Hill. So it might be worth noting the addresses of all of those before you head into the neighborhoods. On Capitol Hill, Eastern Market also has pretty decent public restrooms. Just be mindful of the market's hours. It's not open late and it's not open every day. Georgetown, of course, has a lot of stores and shops and restaurants, and so it's natural to ask, can you just pop into any of them and use their restroom? The unsatisfying answer is maybe. Full service restaurants or bars, meaning places where people sit down and order from a server or a bartender, will of course all have restrooms. You can't really run a business that involves a lot of drinking and not offer some kind of restroom. Whether they will be okay with someone coming in who's not dining or drinking there and using the restroom, well, your mileage may vary. And a lot of smaller shops in Georgetown, think yogurt shops, coffee shops, little clothing stores, they might not even have a restroom for their customers at all. So be mindful of that if you're planning on spending several hours or the day over there. Some people will recommend big chains like Starbucks, but I've found they can be a bit hit or miss. Sometimes they will have a restroom or restrooms plural that you can just walk in and use. Sometimes they might have one, but it first requires you to ask a staff member for a key or some kind of code. Again, your mileage may vary. What about hotels? A lot of people who do travel tips will often give the advice that you can walk in to any hotel, and if you have confidence and act like you belong there, you can walk right into any restroom and use it. And I think this is true, except when it isn't. Some hotels have restrooms that are specifically there for meetings, events, and conferences. And if they're not hosting an event on any given day, the restrooms may simply be locked up. Some hotels have restrooms near the lobby that require a key card to open. So if you're staying at that hotel, obviously this is no problem. But if you're not a guest of the hotel, you might find you can't get in. So with hotels, again, your mileage may vary. What about Metro? New Silver Line stations way out towards the end of the line do have public restrooms, and quite honestly, they're fairly nice. But unfortunately, the older stations, including all of the stations in the city, do not have restrooms. Plenty of people have said that in a pinch or an emergency, they asked the Metro station manager and were allowed to use the staff restroom. If you're going to try to do this, make sure to be extremely polite and just hope that the station manager is in a good mood. Because ultimately, it's their call. What about big events like the 4th of July or the National Cherry Blossom Parade or a big concert on the mall? While the permanent restrooms on the National Mall are mostly sufficient for handling regular sightseeing crowds, they are woefully insufficient for handling crowds at big events. The event organizers are required to provide portable toilets like the ones behind me. As long as you're okay with using portable toilets, you don't have to stress out about finding a restroom if you're attending an event. And of course, because we live in a digital age, there are several apps that crowdsource information about public restrooms that you can download for your trip. I personally tried a few of these for the making of this video, and to my surprise, they are surprisingly decent and I think worth having on your phone. But in practice, crowdsourced data is only as reliable as the volunteers who report it. So unfortunately, you can't expect these apps to be 100% accurate 100% of the time. And hey, since you made it all the way to the end of this video, may I highly recommend watching my 50 Things to Do in DC video next? All you have to do is go ahead and click or tap right over here to check that out. Enjoy your trip.